we'd like to begin the Global Think Tank Forum. This is one of the pre-World Knowledge Forum events this year. I'm Tae-ho Park, President of Lee & Co. Global Commerce Institute. And I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. For today's Global Think Tank Forum, we have invited the IFRI, one of the most prominent and prestigious think tanks in Paris. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Montbrial, the Executive Chairman of the IFRI, and Dr. Nicolas, IFRI's Center for Asian Study Director, for participating in our forum despite it is early in the morning in Paris. We have one more panelist from Korea, Professor Jae-min Lee of Seoul National University Law School. He's an expert on trade law. Let me also say that there are about 40 people in the audience with us, and I'll give some opportunity later to interact with the speakers. As you may know, the theme of today's forum is COVID-19 era and the future international order. Under this theme, we'd like to discuss three basic topics. The first one is about how the new international order will be shaped in the future. I think it might be one of the most critical questions we are facing in the midst of very uncertain global environment. The second topic is about the possible changes in the global value chain. We are also very much anxious to know whether the industrial decoupling between the U.S. and China will be actually realized. The third topic is about the multilateral trading system of the WTO. Can it survive? If not, what other options can we consider? Well, these are the issues we'd like to focus on today. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Montbrial to address on the first topic of how the new international order will be shaped in the future. For the sake of time, please speak your initial remarks within about 10 to 12 minutes. Professor Montbrial, please.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Park. I'm very happy to be in Korea today. And I hope to be physically in Korea in 2 months from now, if it is possible. So the question we are discussing today, the first point is that we are talking of a future international order. I don't know what we mean by an order. I mean, do we have an order today? I think the answer is no. Will we have an order, let's say, in the next 10 years or so? I am not sure. What we are now experiencing is a very fierce competition between the United States and China. This was bound to come. You know, we should remember that when President George W. Bush was elected, on the very first days of his tenure, the then director of the CIA gave him a memorandum putting as a #1 problem for the future the competition with China. But what happened in 2001 was September 11. So September 11, in a way, distracted the attention of the US away from China. And of course, 2001 was also the year China was accepted in the WTO. Perhaps in a further discussion, we could discuss whether it was a wise decision at the time or not. I think it was based also on some illusions about the evolution of China. Be that as it may, the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic, I think acts as an accelerator of trends which existed before. not only in this field, by the way, you can reach the same conclusion in many other areas. So in the last few years, of course, the tensions between China and the US had accelerated because of Trump's presidency, because of his own very particular style. And the pandemic itself accelerated further that evolution. So whether this is related directly or not to the upcoming presidential election in November can be discussed. But with or without election, I think this is a reality. And this goes together with the issue of deglobalization and of multilateralism that we are going to discuss later in this session. But all this is going to force all the rest of us, typically the European Union itself, for instance, or South Korea or other middle powers, we will be asked, we will be pressured under the pressure of the United States to choose between them or the Chinese that will be presented on us as a 0 to 1 choice, a binary choice. And typically, for instance, the UK, because the UK left the European Union, so now the UK has no clear foreign policy. And my own interpretation of their decision, you know, not to deal with Huawei for 5G, my interpretation is that they had no choice because they were forced to do that by Washington. So we have to prepare ourselves to be under the pressure of the United States, but we will also under pressure from China, and China has already, you know, taken steps almost everywhere in the world, including in the European Union with the 16+1 group. So I will conclude this initial presentation by two remarks. The first one is that we are used to talk about geopolitics, about geostrategy. More and more now we talk about geoeconomics or geoeconomic, meaning that the instruments of economic power are now more and more used for political purpose. And this, for instance, the American policy of sanctions go into that direction. So the question is it possible to continue with globalization more or less as we have experienced it in the last, let's say, 25 years or so? Or is this politicization of the economy going to be one of the major elements for deglobalization and return to some nationalistic forces that could, over time, break the whole international system? That's a very big question. And my last preliminary question or remark is about multilateralism as such. We are used to talk about multilateralism, and Professor Lee will talk about it, and Françoise also, I believe. But what do we mean by multilateralism? I think the word multilateralism can be interpreted in many ways. For instance, the UN system is based on the idea of multilateralism, but it is a weak kind of multilateralism, international law. WTO used to be considered as a harder kind of law than the basic UN system, but this might no longer be the case. Now we have a second kind of multilateralism, which is the Western in multilateralism as it existed during the Cold War. This worked because the Soviet Union, you know, had actually did not follow the US in 1945. So the multilateralist system worked in the Western or Western Asian the framework, which was a limited kind of multilateralism. And it worked because there was a clear leader. And that clear leader was the United States. But the United States will not be the leader of the world. And they will no longer be the leader of anything like the triangle as we used to know it with the European Union and with East Asia, or with his allies from Japan, Korea, etc. So can multilateralism in a strong sense work without a leader? My answer is probably not, no. And the last kind of multilateralism is the strong version of multilateralism, which is what we are doing, what we are trying to do, for instance, within the European Union to shape a new kind of political unit. That's strong multilateralism. So when we talk about multilateralism, we have to make sure that we agree on what kind of multilateralism we have in mind. And we have to keep in mind that you cannot, less than ever, separate economics and politics.
Thank you, Professor Montbrial. Maybe Dr. Lee or Professor Lee or Dr. Nicola, if you have any short comments or questions about the initial remark made by Professor Montbrial. Dr. Lee, do you have it? Okay. Dr. Lee first, and then I will invite Dr. Nicola.
Sure, thank you. Professor Montbrial, thank you very much for the very nice introduction of the New World Order. So do you basically think, summing up your presentation, so do you basically think that it will be perhaps, at least for the time being, impossible for us to turn the tide backwards so as to restore the existing previous multilateralism? So it's time for us to think about new types of multilateralism, be it hard fashion or soft fashion, or new type of multilateralism. Did I understand your point correctly, Professor Montbrial?
Yes, I'm afraid the answer is yes, because we have a real power struggle, and based essentially initially between the US and China, but as I tried to say, the other main actors are also forced to enter the game. Well, and by the way, the European Union, I didn't say it, but we have realized over the last year or months that we have become too much dependent, politically dependent on China as well. And the basic multilateralist ideology is based, I repeat, on the separation between politics and economics. Today, it is, I repeat, impossible to separate politics and economics. I am not saying that in the longer run, multilateralism will not come back in some way or in one way or another. But I think that it will not come anytime soon. In the long run, I think this is the global world interest, if I may say so, to restore some kind of multilateralism, because whether we like it or not, we are all interdependent today. Interdependence is a fact that will not be reversed. So we will be forced to rediscover some kind of organization, some kind of global governance. But I doubt that it can be restored again anytime soon. The great risk, of course, is to lose control of the process in this economic political struggle in the coming years.
Okay, Dr. Nicola.
Yes, well, more than a question, it's rather a remark or a comment, and a compliment to what has been explained by Professor Montbrial. I cannot agree more with him that there are huge definition gaps And so when we talk about multilateralism, we don't necessarily mean exactly the same thing if we are Westerners or if we are Chinese, for instance. And to add some complexity to what has already been said, I think that there is another form of multilateralism, which is the Chinese version of it. And what China has in mind very often when it talks about multilateralism is actually multi-bilateralism. This is the way China approaches politics most of the time. And multilateralism is, of course, has nothing to do with the way we imagine multilateralism. So I just wanted to add this other form of multilateralism, which adds further complexity to what has already been explained by Professor Montbrial. But I think that it is a key issue that we have these definition gaps. And so when we discuss or we negotiate, we may be using the same words, but not meaning the same thing. And so this makes the negotiation particularly tricky. We may get the impression that we are reaching a solution, but it's not necessarily the case.
You know, Dr. Nicola, you mentioned that multiple bilateralism China may consider, but I think exactly the U.S. is doing the same thing these days. Don't you think?
True.
So
yes.
the two big guys are now dealing with everything bilaterally, which is a big problem. Maybe we can come back to this later.
The only difference, if I may, the only difference is that the U.S. does not dare to call that multilateralism, whereas China calls it multilateralism. That's the minor difference between the two. But I do agree that they act exactly in the same way.
Well, you know, let me move to the next topic. But before I do that, I will ask Professor Montbrial to think about a little bit and come back to us later. When you talk about U.S.-China disputes, many Western countries and also market economies complain about the fundamental problem of China. For example, China claims still they are a developing country within the WTO, and also they are using heavy state capitalism, subsidizing, helping, government organizations, government firms, that kind of stuff. I think this is a fundamental problem China is having. And in one way or another, not only the United States, we all have to address on these issues. And this is, I don't know how to do it, because they are escalating this kind of disputes, but we don't see any kind of collective actions or collective solutions yet. But we'll discuss that a little bit later. Now I invite Dr. Nicola talk about possible changes in global value chain or decoupling between the US and China in terms of industrial products. Dr. Nicola.
Yeah, thank you. So can I have my presentation, my PowerPoint presentation on screen, please? Yes, thank you. Let me first thank the organizers, of course, for organizing this very interesting session. Thrilled to be here. I didn't want to encroach on Professor Montbrial's turf, and so I chose a much narrower perspective on the issue of international order, and I will be concentrating on industrial organization. So, next slide, please. Let me first explain how I see the COVID-19 associated economic crisis. Interestingly, this crisis is absolutely unprecedented in many respects. And the first point to mention and to stress is that it all started out with a health crisis. And it is actually the response that was given to the health crisis that triggered an economic crisis. In the case of China, of course, the Chinese authorities started by locking down Wuhan, the city of Wuhan, and then very quickly they actually locked down the whole province, Hubei province. And this lockdown created, a huge economic problem since the economic activity basically ground to a halt. And this was not only the case in the Hubei province, it spread to the rest of the country. And the reason for this is that movement of people in particular were restricted. So at the end of the day, you had basically no economic activity in the whole of China. So logistic chains were disrupted or totally broken, and this is why the economic activity came to a halt. this economic crisis spread to the rest of the world very quickly due to the very key role that China plays in the global value chains. China is a huge supplier of intermediate products, of parts and components, etc. And so whatever happens in China impacts the rest of the world. Just one example, of course, is the automotive industry. Car manufacturer Hyundai had to stop its production in early February due to shortage of components coming out of China. And so the economic crisis spread very quickly from China to the rest of the world, even before the health crisis also spread to the rest of the world. So we had different crises coming in waves, which is also something that is very specific of the current COVID-19 associated crisis. So we had a supply shock, and this supply shock was further compounded by a demand shock. Because of course, if you had no economic activity in China, the demand declined or even plummeted quite dramatically. And so we had a combination of these two shocks, supply and demand. Another point also, another form of impact of this COVID-19 crisis is the fact that the very existence of global value chains was very much put into question. And in particular, there was a questioning of the just-in-time approach, no inventory approach, and a number of other cost-efficient strategies were also deeply questioned during this COVID-19 crisis. So if we want to summarize this, what we can say is that well, from an industry perspective, this COVID-19-led economic crisis has really exposed the vulnerability of the complex and highly fragmented global value chains that had been driving globalization so far. In the past, global value chains enable multinationals to increase their efficiency through fragmented task-based specialization. And this is this fragmented task-based specialization that was put into question during this COVID-19 crisis. So it was really a major shock, of course, to the industry and to the way industry had been organized so far. So next slide for the responses. Thank you. So, well, of course, the various companies, industries, etc., try to think of responses to this problem triggered by the COVID-19 crisis. And one first response is what we call reshoring. That is relocation of production away from countries like China to main or home countries. This is the case for Japan, for instance. Japanese companies are relocating production in Japan away from China to some extent, of course. Same thing for Korea, actually. And there are also, well, subsidies provided by the government to encourage this move. So reshoring is one first response to the crisis that has been encountered. Another way of responding to the crisis is also shortening the global value chains. Since these value chains were found to be vulnerable, one element of the value chain is broken, the whole value chain breaks down. So one way is just to shorten the global value chain as to reduce the risk of disruption. So this is another possibility, and of course this may end up with what we observe as regionalization of the global value chains. A further response also is diversification of suppliers. We see that there is a big risk of being dependent on one single supplier, in particular if this supplier is China. So one single supplier is really a problem. It may be cost efficient, but this cost efficiency is at the price of security, economic security. So here we see a little bit of a tension between economic efficiency on the one hand and economic security on the other hand. So we have this tension between these two objectives, and that may create problems. And so there is a discussion about the need to diversify, to be able to rely on multiple suppliers and not just on one single supplier. And here, there is a discussion here on two issues, one being resilience, which is the ability to go through a crisis and recover eventually, relatively quickly, and robustness, which is the continuation of operation in difficult times. So depending on which of the two you favor, you may end up, well, favoring single sourcing or diversified sourcing. Okay, but anyway, there are a number of discussions about these various options. To be honest, some of these responses, some of these lessons had already been drawn from earlier crises, from earlier developments. We had seen a crisis at the time of the Fukushima catastrophe in 2011, and we also had seen some issues, similar issues, at the time of the Thai floods in 2011 as well. So some companies had already thought of these various responses, of these various changes in the way they operate. But this time, it is much more obvious that a response is definitely needed. Of course, there is another event that had also pushed companies to think of reorganization of their value chains, and this other event is the Sino-US trade tension. So all these things are not fully new, but they appear to be more pressing than it was the case in the past. There is a final set of responses that can also be given to the COVID-19 crisis, and it is a total redesigning, reorganization, but more structural reorganization of the global value chains. And this has been, again, stressed by the current crisis. By redesigning of the global value chains, what I have in mind is, for instance, the use of remote working, but also the more intensive use of artificial intelligence controlled production. And one very good example is the more intense use of 3D printing. This 3D printing story is quite interesting, because 3D printing enables the shift from mass production and economies of scale to mass customization. In 3D printing, value added will be stemming from the design, from the programming phase, delivering the specifications for replicable 3D printing. And the customer-related activities addressing the client's needs. So the manufacturing step tends to be a highly commodified, low value-added activity replicated in many countries. This is totally different from what we had with mass production. So in this case, what we will have at the end of the day is more trade in data and no longer trade in goods. And this is something totally new. And this will create new issues. And next slide, this will create problems or policy challenges. So if we want to focus on the policy challenges, and I come to the 3D printing story at the very end, what we have in terms of policy challenges today is first the real need to preserve trade openness. In response to the COVID-19 crisis, what we have seen are pressure for protectionism. Since the countries are dependent on the others and they see that it makes them vulnerable, what they want to do is to look inward. So less trade openness. So there is definite need to preserve trade openness. WTO may be a way of doing it, but WTO is not in good shape. We already said that. A second policy challenge is to preserve openness to foreign direct investment, which is another dimension of openness. And again, the COVID-19 crisis, having highlighted the vulnerability created by high interdependence, by excessive dependence on some partners, has also led to more inward-looking positions. And it has also led to more screening of foreign direct investment, because there is a risk of, security risk coming from foreign direct investment. So we also have this tendency to want to keep some competitors at bay. And so preserving openness to FDI is another policy challenge in addition to preserving trade openness. And the final point is the need for new rules, because there are new forms of trade. And here I come back to the 3D printing example that I was talking about before. What we see with this new forms of industrial organization is the emergence of new forms of trade. Trade in data rather than trade in goods. we don't have any rules so far for these new forms of trade. And we definitely need new rules. And this will be a challenge for perhaps the WTO or other forms of organization which will have to regulate trade in the future. So we have a full set of new challenges that will have to be embraced by whatever order will be in place at the end of the day. So we have pressures for deglobalization. We have pressures for challenging to the standard way of globalization that we have observed so far. And so this calls for new rules, new ways of regulating the economy. So thank you. 감사합니다.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Nicola, for your short but very comprehensive presentation on global value chains and future challenges and kind of options companies will face. Are there any questions and comments? I will invite Professor Montbrial. Do you have any comment or questions?
Well, I always have comments. Well, 3 points. You know, the French like to have 3 points. Well, the first one is that very much like we need to distinguish several interpretations of multilateralism, I think we have to distinguish several kinds of disruption in value chains when talking about value chains. Françoise Nicolas spoke very well of the current disruption, and she also mentioned other disruptions in the recent past related to Fukushima, for instance, major natural catastrophes or floods. But we also have another kind of value chain disruptions, which is political disruptions. I always come back to the issue of the intersection between politics and economics. You know, the American policy of sanctions, political sanction, is, I repeat, the systematic use of economic tools for the sake of political objective. The GCOA, the Iranian issue is, of course, probably the best example that one can give today. And I am very worried that the US, with or without Trump, is going to use more and more in the future their economic power in that sense, you know, to reach political objectives. So this creates new kinds of very powerful reasons for de-globalization, if we interpret de-globalization in the sense of affecting value chains and finding critical points in value chains that create dependencies. So that's one point which has to be discussed. And of course, the Chinese are going in a much more subtle way, much more progressive way, because it is not in their interest to do it immediately, but over the long term, they will do the same. All the discussion about the 5G, Huawei, and so forth and so on is related to that. My second point, more briefly, Professor Bach, you raised the issue, I don't know if it is the time to do it now, but on the Chinese policies dealing with their state organizations, subsidies, and so forth and so on. Let me just at this stage make one remark. I think, since you personally, Professor Bach, a WTO expert, very much so, but I think there is a fundamental flaw in the WTO system, which is to reduce the issue of economic liberalism to the trade issue, you know, the issue of direct investment and all that Françoise Nicolas also mentioned. This is outside the framework of the WTO. And if in the future, if we have to restore some sort of multilateralism, it will be very important to have a much more ambitious, a much more inclusive approach, including, therefore, this investment, not only the investment issue, but how we deal with public goods, national public goods versus global public goods, and so forth, and so on. So my last and very quick point is that Dr. Nicola is absolutely right when she mentions, without proposing a solution, the problem of how to trade the trade in data. That's a very, very important issue which still has to be defined in clear terms.
Dr. Lee, Professor Lee?
Sure.
Very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly. Dr. Nicola, thank you very much for the explanation on GVC, and I liked your summary, your conclusion based upon data flow issue. Again, as Professor Monbrial just mentioned, I think the data issue will bring about seismic changes in the global trading regime, and in that light, we should focus more on finding proper norms, as you just mentioned, in finding proper norms, establishing proper norms on data flow. Many countries are now trying to find and experiment new norms on trade, on data, but there's still a long way to go. As you just mentioned, this is a very important topic. It's very commercially lucrative and invites a very controversial policy issues as well. So unless we have a clear idea about what we can do and what we cannot do, then we might be in a more dangerous situation. That goes back to the topic that Professor Monbrial just mentioned in his initial presentation, where we have to separate the policies, the politics from the economic issues. And data is an area where the sovereignty issue can easily creep into the realm of trade issues. So that's where we should be very critical, very cautious in finding new norms in a proper way. Thank you.
Okay, before I move to Professor
May I add
Lee's...
something?
You want to have some response? Okay.
Yeah.
But
I wanted to
let me say a few words and then you respond, okay? When I hear this possible changes of global value chain, it is quite relevant topic, but sometimes it is overemphasized because right now COVID-19 and the U.S. China disputes, so companies are facing huge challenges. However, if your company operate in China and your total production is to serve Chinese domestic market, you cannot change anything because it's so important for them. So it depends on your own situation. You provide all types of adjustment, reshoring, shortening global value chains. You are right, but for some companies, these are not the option. They just stay there. So what I'm saying is here, Professor Monbrial said in the first initial remark, some trend is moving on, and COVID-19 and the U.S. China dispute actually accelerating this trend or decelerating or disrupting this kind of trend. I think one trend you have to consider is this. China is now becoming a more and more world market rather than world factory. So I don't know, but in the future, China will provide a huge market for everybody because they have a huge population. They cannot produce everything within the country. The second thing is Chinese wages are rising quite rapidly. If you compare the wages of China and wages of Vietnam wages per capita income is less than $3,000, and Chinese are over $10,000. So already, some companies are leaving China, move to Southeast Asia. Some companies are moving to India. So that kind of trend is already started, and COVID-19, U.S.-China dispute may accelerate this kind of trend. So we have a huge trend is moving on without before this kind of thing happens. But you're right, because of this pandemic and U.S. China disputes, you have to open more options. Nicola, Dr. Nicola.
Yeah, I just wanted to react to Professor Montbrial's remark about the political disruptions versus the natural catastrophe-led disruptions. I agree that you have these two categories, but what is, I think, specific in the current crisis is that a natural disaster, so to speak, catastrophe and led disruption actually triggered a political disruption. So you have the two things combined. You have initially the COVID-19 crisis, which is health crisis. Okay, you can equate that to a natural disaster kind of disruption, and this has led to political disruptions. It is because you have this issue of national security that was really highlighted during this crisis. And so a number of countries seized this opportunity to intervene and to protect themselves. And so you end up with a politically led disruption on top of the natural disaster-led disruption. So the two are not necessarily totally separate. They are actually combined. So I think that the distinction is extremely valid, but in this specific case, the two types of disruptions are totally intertwined, so to speak. So I think it's a very interesting point. I hadn't not thought of that myself, so I think it's an interesting aspect. The second thing is about data. Yeah, data is the new oil. Everybody says so, and the country controlling the data actually controls a lot. So I agree with you. And on the remark that you made, Professor Park, about the deglobalization, which may be a little bit exaggerated, and actually, some countries cannot really pull out of China. I agree with you. China is both a supplier and a consumer, which is actually why we had this combination of a supply and demand shock coming from China. It was a supply shock since China is supplying a number of companies in the world, and once China is blocked, is stalled, the rest of the economy or the world economy is also stalled. So that's the supply shock. But China today is a big consumer. Yep. And so what we have also seen is a drop in demand coming from China. And it is another channel through which the crisis actually spread to the rest of the world. So we have the combination of these two shocks, supply and demand, and this highlights the role of China now as a consumer and not exclusively as a supplier. And in terms of reallocation of production, a number of companies actually do not fully pull out of China. They will remain in China because they want to serve the Chinese market, which is a big market. So what they actually do is engage in a so-called China plus one strategy, which means staying in China, but duplicating production in some other countries so as to reduce the vulnerability. This may not be optimal in purely economic terms, because duplication may be costly, but this is the way of securing outlets. And again, we have a tension between the pure economic perspective and a more political perspective or security-oriented perspective, so to speak. So you may no longer end up with a fully cost-efficient solution, but this is what you have to do if you want to maintain, different markets.
Okay. Rather than discussing further among us, let's move to Professor Lee and then come back to this general discussion later on. I will invite Professor Lee to talk about the multilateral trading system of the WTO, how it can be reformed, or if not, what kind of other options we can consider. Professor Lee.
Thank you, Professor Park. Very difficult questions. As they say, when it rains, it pours. I think the COVID-19 pandemic perhaps could not have come at a worse time. We have already suffered the global surge of protectionism. And as discussed, U.S. China confrontation and the absence of reliable norms and all of a sudden we have the pandemic situation. The first half of 2020 is almost eliminated. So we are now at a crossroad and at a dead end at this time. So there are many topics for WTO reform, and many people are talking about WTO reform, but at the same time, I think there is a feeling of WTO reform fatigue, I would put it that way, if I could put it that way as well. But in any event, we just hope, I think many people hope that WTO can survive this storm and can re-emerge as an entity that can show new leadership for multilateralism. Again, multilateralism is an issue, is a topic that can carry many different names and definitions as we discussed before. So perhaps we can save the WTO, but at the same time, we can redefine its role in a way that is in conformity with the new role that the global community is expecting of the WTO. So we can look into this issue when we are going back to the table for WTO reform for the future. More importantly, for MC12, perhaps next year. As we discussed so far, there are a couple of issues when we talk about WTO reform. Of course, the most important thing is the appellate body issue. How to restore or save the appellate body, and the industrial subsidy issue. How to reformulate norms to regulate industrial subsidies and fisheries subsidies, and also how to deal with the investment issue. As Dr. Nicola just mentioned, the investment issue, which has been left outside the WTO universe, how to engage investment in the WTO context, which seems to be quite complex, but in any event, the investment facilitation issue is one of the topics as well, and how to regulate the state-owned enterprises for the future. And most importantly, how to find new norms for digital economy and data issues. All these issues are very complex and very controversial, and sadly, states have failed anyway up until now, even before the pandemic. And now, all of a sudden, the issues are there anyway, and states' confrontation and states' divergent views are still there, presenting different arguments and different positions. And now, the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a very difficult situation, and I would say nobody would envy the job of the Director General of the WTO at this point. But having said that, I think perhaps because there are so many things are at their lowest points at the same time, because so many countries' expectation levels are so low for the WTO, at least for the time being. Perhaps this is the perfect timing for talk about all these issues from clean slate. And then we can focus on just the simple basic things for the global trading regime. Let's forget about the difficult issues. Let's forget about complex issues. Let's forget about good issues, but that have been turned out to be quite controversial. Let's focus on the basics, such as how to reform dispute settlement. I think that seems to be an important issue. And again, how to find the key elements of the digital economy. Or again, how to find some core elements of increasingly important national security topic. So we can focus on some basic issues and then only finding some consensus on those basic core issues, perhaps we can restart and reinvigorate multilateralism through the WTO. That multilateralism, perhaps it could be different multilateralism, as Professor Monbrial mentioned in his opening statement. Maybe we have been striving so hard in a hard fashion of multilateralism in the WTO for the past 25 years. It has been successful to some extent. It has been also controversial to some extent. Now we can find and redefine rather, the multilateralism in the global trade regime, where we can bring many countries on board, maybe different views, maybe different confrontations, but still we can get many countries on board, and then we can have we can try to restore confidence and trust, at least for the new types of multilateralism. And then we can start from that point onward. So we don't know yet who will lead the WTO in a couple of months' time. Perhaps the wise leader will emerge from the group of 8, and then he or she will lead the countries of 164 in the right direction for the restoration of multilateralism defined in a new way. So we'll hope to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. I'm a retired professor. I served professor also for 20 years, but I feel, hearing from Professor Lee, academicians are quite still naive. We still hope for restoration of the multilateral system of WTO. I feel like it's very, very difficult, realistically. But anyway, we have to wait and see. At this moment, I want to invite Professor Monbrial. How do you respond, or you have some questions or comments?
Well, first of all, Professor Bark, I agree that academicians, especially young academicians, may be naive, but I think it's good that they are naive. And please, Professor Lee, remain naive, at least for a while. But I think, and I am serious, it is possible to remain naive or idealistic in a certain sense, and nevertheless realistic. Because if we give up entirely the ideal objectives, it means that we surrender somewhere. So this being said, I would like to stress one point. Professor Bark said that today the Chinese economy is moving away from just being just a factory of the world. You mentioned some companies moving to India, in Europe. Many firms talk about moving some plants to Eastern Europe, for instance, the eastern part of the European Union, or North Africa, or these sort of things. Well, that's of course true. Nevertheless, I think that if the political situation continues to deteriorate further, China is large enough, to concentrate on herself to some extent, with 1.3 or more billion inhabitants, except for one point. And here we are back to very, very classical situations, which is access to raw materials. China can do everything potentially, but by herself. And she's large enough again, to benefit from increasing returns, etc., etc. But there is one thing that she will remain dependent on, which is access to raw materials. And now it is Schumpeter, in his history of economic analysis, who reminds of the importance of economic history. Economic history is very important, economic and political history. If you look at the interwar period, it was the first globalization was at the turn of the 20th century. That was globalization of the time. And that did not prevent moving towards the First World War. And how did the First World War come about? It was competition for access to natural resources. And this is the essence of imperialism. Now, my own interpretation of the rivalry between the US and China is that both countries are each in its own sense. They are both imperial countries. And as for China, the Silk Road and everything else is a formidable, and the military also, the military development is conceived as a way to continue to preserve access to natural resources. So my point really is that on the one hand, we have to be sophisticated enough to think of the new economic developments, and especially, of course, this major issue of data control and so forth and so on, these new kinds of interdependence. But on the other hand, we should not forget the most classical, basic ideas, facts of economic interdependence, and particularly this issue of access to natural resources. So that's my, I think, most important remark at this stage. The other one, there is another one. I think, Professor Lee, in your excellent presentation, you mentioned, you used, I think, at least twice, the word confidence, trust, confidence. This is fundamentally what is lacking now. The fundamental sin of President Trump, for which I think he will be severely judged by history, is that he has massively contributed to the destruction of trust. You know, if you look at arms control, I like personally to make a comparison between arms control in the Cold War time and economic governance issues. In arms control, we started with the two superpowers of the time, who, of course, with total mistrust. And the arms control agreements were based on confidence-building measures, as they called it, you know, which implied each of the two superpowers to have access to the inner core of the other country. You know, that, think about it. It is as if transposed in the economic field, the governor of the president of the Federal Reserve System had access today to the inside working of the Central Bank of China and vice versa. You know, so confidence-building measures is what we need to do today. Are we prepared to do that? That's a big, big question mark.
Okay, Dr. Nicola, do you have any idea how to revive or restore the multilateral system of WTO?
Sure, I have this solution. No, more seriously, I think that there is one option that is open. And this option is to go through plurilateral agreements. Mm-hmm. This is something very much according to the spirit of the GATT to begin with and WTO eventually. So the point is to get a limited number of countries to sit together, discuss on a topic that is of high interest to them. This topic may not be of interest to any other country, to all countries in the world, but it is of interest for a limited number of countries. So this limited number of countries sit together, discuss, and come up with some way of, well, regulating this specific issue. This is the gist of plurilateral agreement. And then these plurilateral agreements may be eventually, well, open to other participants. This is exactly the spirit of the most favored nation mechanism. It's exactly the same thing. So this is very much part of the WTO system, and this is something that should be, I guess, more often used. This is used to some extent, but I guess this should be enlarged. This should be used more systematically, and I think it's an easier way to negotiate. If you want to put together the 180-something countries, this is impossible, and of course you end up with a deadlock. But if you go through these plurilateral agreements, then this may be a solution. And another way is also to look at what is being done within, again, more limited fora. And I'm here referring to the CPTPP, for instance, or RCEP. In both negotiations, it is not only, the discussion is not only about trade, standard trade. It's about a number of other things. It's about government procurement, it's about foreign direct investment, it's about labor standards, it's about a number of other things. I mean, you have 19 chapters in CPTPP. So, well, one possibility is also to look at what's been done in these negotiations and try to see what can be, well, adapted to some extent for the WTO. So I think that there are many ways to go ahead with negotiations. We are not totally stuck. For the time being, we are. But we should not despair too much. Well, we should not be desperate. There are ways. And so what is being done at this limited level, either through plurilateral agreements or through regional trade agreements, as they are called, even if they are not really regional, this can be a source of inspiration for a more broader negotiation.
Okay. Before I turning to the Professor Lee, let me just say a very short remark. Based on my own experience, if you want to change anything within the WTO, all the suggestions should be made through members, because WTO is a member-driven organization. But members never be able to reach a consensus. So you cannot do anything. That's why I emphasize, like under the Pascal Lamy, he asked outside experts to provide very nice suggestions how to reform the WTO. Members reject this because you don't get our permission to do this in the first place. We didn't give you a mandate to do this. So it's very, very difficult, one way or another. So that's why it's almost impossible to change anything within the current system of decision-making mechanism within the WTO. This is my frustration at that time. Dr. Lee, Professor Lee, you just respond to some comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments. I would also agree that PTA could be a good starting point for the new breakthrough. CPTPP, USMCA, and RCEP are good examples for the new experiments also. Regarding PTA, the problem is, as briefly mentioned before, the system already perhaps block the facilitation of PTA negotiation, such as MFN or free riding problem as well. So again, it's worthwhile to explore the option, but there seems to be a significant block in implementing the idea in the future. And again, Dr. Meng-Muriel's emphasis on confidence and trust, I think that also applies to CPTPP and other new the mega FTAs as well. For instance, for CPTPP, it's a good starting point, but at the same time, United States, the starter of the agreement withdrew at the last minute. So that sort of thing, or that sort of stance, could undermine the establishment of confidence in terms of the new norm. Well, I think if we could choose just one item for the WTO, I think it's quite frustrating to see how WTO or WTO discussion is going on these days. But at the same time, if we could expect just one item from the WTO, perhaps that could be dispute settlement function. Again, granted, there are many issues that should be reformed, even with respect to the dispute settlement. But at the same time, if we can save some core elements of the dispute settlement, even with or without the appellate system, still that can provide the global community with some reliable, some reasonable reliance on the new system. But it all depends upon how the current negotiation is moving on. But again, all things considered, the WTO is at the lowest point, and perhaps maybe this is not the lowest point. We could go even deeper, lower. So that's very frustrating. Thank you.
Okay, according to our program, we have just about 26 minutes left. So I will set aside last 10 minutes for interacting with the audience. So I will just give you one simple question to three of you, and maybe you can give us some simple answer. It's not simple answer, but it's very fundamental questions, but short answer. What I'm saying is here, because we are talking about new international order, in terms of trade and commerce and all kind of things, some people are suggesting maybe after November this year, I'm not predicting who will be the next president of the United States, but President Trump proposed a kind of new initiative called New Economic Prosperity Network, Economic Prosperity Network, EPN. There's another, I don't know the details, but that's just to give an initiative. Some other experts are suggesting that maybe U.S. may try to return to TPP, join the CPTPP, upgrade the CPTPP to the real advanced TPP. And some other extreme kind of suggestion is, why not we should create new international organization which may be dealing with international trade. Somebody called it WTO 2, or some democratic countries which are sharing same kind of positions on international norms. Why not we should create the international organization? So, this is really, I made up these questions, but I will turn to everybody to give us some kind of short thinking about these options. Can I start with Professor Monbrial?
Thank you very much. Well, all these options, of course, are open. First, let me remark that both the United States and China are not without vulnerabilities inside. I think it's another story. We don't have time to develop that, but I think that the United States is showing right now major fractures inside domestically that goes much beyond dispute between neoconservatives and neo-socialists in the Democratic Party. And so I think the American consensus is is at stake now. And China, of course, itself has also a lot of vulnerability. So let us not think as if both countries were invulnerable giants. They are very vulnerable themselves. But if what I am saying is true, it means that it will be more and more very difficult for both countries to make a consensus to build up a new kind of order, because you need the strength for that. And if I take the example of creating new international organizations, as Professor Bach just mentioned, well, anyone who is familiar with Professor North, the economic historian who won the Nobel Prize in economics a few years ago, precisely on this subject, that is the issue of how institutions emerge and contribute to the development, economic development. The economic institutions emerge, they emerge from some natural forces and leadership. If there is no leadership, that's the center of my current intervention. If the US is not in a position, with or without Trump, to exert leadership, and the same for China, how is it possible to imagine launching new kinds of ambitious trade negotiations, or even more, to create new institutions? And again, history, we have to look more carefully at the history of Bretton Woods and all the institutions, GATT at the time, and so forth and so on, which emerged from 1944 and later, and all also related to security, because there was, I repeat, I always raise this factor, economics is not independent from politics. It can be more or less dependent, but it is never totally independent. So if I, to put all these pieces together in some way, I reached the conclusion that the most the urgent issues now are not to launch, to try to launch too ambitious ideas, because this will not work. We have to concentrate on some very, very basic points. And the most basic point is, okay, we recognize that we have conflicts of interest. That's part of life. But we should also recognize that these conflicts of interest have to be resolved in a peaceful way. And the step number one is to restore confidence. So my key terms I would like to put in this meeting today, this conference today, is confidence building measures.
Very nice. Dr. Professor Lee, briefly.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Park. If we continue to stay on this course, maybe new international organization is not entirely impossible. I hope that is not the situation, but if we continue on this course, then perhaps the concrete discussion on new organization will emerge in the foreseeable future. Or if we maintain the WTO as it is today, perhaps that future WTO, even though it carries the same name, maybe it is not exactly the same as we have known so far. If we continue on this course, and if we fail to address the problem in a meaningful way, to avoid that situation, I think the only way, the only option for now for us is to rebuild the confidence and to rebuild the trust in the system. And the level of confidence will determine whether we will proceed toward the new organization or not. Thank you.
Dr. Nicola.
Yeah, well, I think that there are a number of options on the table today. There are a number of initiatives launched by a limited group of countries, and I think Korea is part of one such group, proposing alternative mechanisms. So what they are pushing is not a reform of the whole of WTO, but it's to engage with like-minded countries in, alternative initiatives. So more limited initiatives, and this is the case for the dispute settlement mechanism. As far as I know, there is some kind of alternative dispute settlement mechanism on the side of the WTO, since the WTO one is totally blocked. So there is an alternative mechanism. And I think that this can be the way to go. I mean, extremely pragmatic, limited, modest, so to speak, but realistic. If you can team up together with like-minded countries and go ahead with a proposal, then okay, well, that's possible. At least it's a way forward. And a larger number of countries may eventually join. So I think that this is the only pragmatic, realistic way to go these days. So to try to engage in a broad reform of WTO is, well, I guess a non-starter. Similarly, to try to set up a new organization, this is certainly not something that we should push. Once you have a new organization, you cannot get rid of it, okay? International organizations, once they are in place, they never die, okay? There is not a single case of an international organization which died. I know that everybody will mention the League of Nations, but even this one did not really die. So do not try to set up a new organization. Then you'll be stuck with it and with a budget, et cetera, a number of problems. So don't do that. I think it's certainly a non-starter. But to go the modest way through a limited number of countries, well, like-minded countries, pushing for alternative mechanisms, I think that is the only realistic way to go.
Okay.
And I think South Korea is very active in this field. It is part of the alternative dispute settlement mechanism, for instance. So Korea should be a force.
Okay. Well, since I already talked about this, I want to invite, if possible, from questions from our audience here. Anybody who wants to ask questions, raise your hand and identify yourself briefly. And then, if possible, you can, address this question to specific person. Okay? 하시겠어요? Yes, please. We have a microphone. Microphone over there.
안녕하세요. 저는 디지털 뉴미디어 포럼의 정책위원 이진원입니다. 오늘 이렇게 귀한 자리를 마련해주는 매일경제그룹에 먼저 감사드리고요. 짧게 질문 드리겠습니다. 우리는 언제까지나 미중 간에 있어서 정치적, 경제적인 갈등을 겪어야 될지, 또 옆에 있는 일본, 미, 중, 일 3국 간에서 어떻게 하는 게 좋을지 우리 박 본부장님께 여쭙고 싶습니다. 이상입니다.
I have one question which is addressing to me, so I have to respond. But I want to collect one more question. Anybody? Yeah, yes. Okay.
I'd like to ask this question to Professor Monbrial. I'm Won Sum-Yoon. I'm from Maeil Business Newspaper. I'm deputy editor. And my question is, who will be the next U.S. president? and what impact will next president will give on the global governance? I mean, given that the global we are suffering from the lack of global leadership in many fields, including the trade issue. So this is for Professor Monbrial. Thank you.
다른 분 또 있어요? 있으시면 손 들으시면 내가 한 분만 더 받아볼게요. 없는 것 같아요. Okay. Did you hear the first question, Professor Monbrial or Dr. Nicola?
The first question was in Korean.
Okay. So
We
let me.
heard it. You don't understand.
I heard the question on who will be the next president, and
Okay.
I know also the gentleman who asked the question, who is a friend from Maikung, I think.
Yes. Let me interpret. Let me give you an interpretation of the first question. This gentleman raised the question until when we have to be concerning about the U.S. China disputes, in many areas. And living in Korea, we are really concerned about the trilateral relations between China, Japan, and Korea. Right now, the relations are not very smooth. And what can we do? That's what he's asking to me. Very difficult question. Actually, I will spend a few minutes to answer that question. When I served the government in 2012, the relationship was quite nice at the time. So we actually, three leaders of the countries, agree upon to implement the trilateral FTA agreement. So we started these negotiations. Because when you talk about economic integration in East Asia or even broad Asia, without integration of China and Japan and also Korea, we cannot say anything. It's not meaningful. So that's why it's very important to have a solid economic cooperation and integration. But sadly, again, political issues, historical issues, very sensitive non-economic issues are developed, and the relationship become very different now. Korea, Japan relations, we are as you know, if I borrow words, we are in the very low or lowest point for the last many years. And Korea, China doing okay, but China and Japan are also a rivalry because behind the scene, U.S. is there. So I cannot have any specific answer to you, but at least if you leave the issues like political issues set aside, other sensitive issues, at least economic issues could be raised among three countries, so we can actually talk about a deeper cooperation, leaving these other issues to the politicians. But as I said, these days, these issues are so closely interlinked, we cannot do that. So for example, for Korea-Japan issues, we suggest to the government, why not we should propose to join the CPTPP, purely within the economic framework. But it doesn't really work. We cannot see everything purely on economic terms these days. So I'm sorry to give you this answer, but we need a future, younger generations cooperation among three countries, because in that way they can solve the problem. Let me go back to Professor Maeil. You received a question from our fellow. So do you have any idea who will be the next president of the United States?
Well, of course, Trump can win the election. I think every observer thinks it is still possible for him to win the election. Second, Biden might win the election. Sleepy Joe, as Trump correctly calls him. But if Sleepy Joe is elected, I think it would be a big mistake to believe that we would just come back to the status quo ante. But I would not rule out a third man or a woman, no, because the upcoming elections is absolutely unprecedented. There has been no campaign, in fact.
Yes.
There might be no campaign, so that will be a very strange election. And I insisted earlier on the fact that the United States is going through a deep internal crisis. And with a deep internal crisis, you can never rule out a third man or woman. That could happen. So the degree of uncertainty is extremely high. And as far as the future foreign policy is going to be, of course, if Trump is re-elected, I think all the nice things you are talking about are unlikely to happen. I think the situation will continue to be extraordinarily tense, but even if a wiser man is elected, I think the confrontation will not be resolved in a few years, because, and that's my last word, what are the stakes? What is the issue? What are we talking about? We are talking about rivalry for primacy. Who will be the #1 country in the 21st century? And the United States is not ready to give up. And the Chinese want to win.
Okay, we are about to close our discussion, but let me give you each panelist 1 minute to give a kind of final words before we close. Professor Lee.
Thank you, Professor Bach. Thank you. We today talked about new international order and how we will expect, what type of international order we can expect from the current situation. Well, still many things are uncertain, and at the same time, many issues are unclear, but at least this type of discussion and the candid discussion for the future order and future paradigm is very important. So hopefully we can have some clearer idea in the second half of this year, so that we can expect what the next year will look like for us all. This is truly unprecedented time, and many things remain unclear. But at the same time, it's a good opportunity for us to think about new international order in the right direction. Thank you.
Dr. Nicola?
Yeah, well, two things. The first thing, I couldn't agree more with Professor Montbrial that the rivalry is here to stay. There won't be any outcome anytime soon. You know, China and the U.S. are really competing for primacy, so there is no way there will be a solution, you know, in the coming years. So this rivalry is here to stay. We have to accept it. And again, if Joe Biden gets elected, it won't make a major difference. And it would be a mistake to think that it will be the case. The style will be different, but the bottom line is very much the same. So there will still be a rivalry with China. So don't expect any major change with Biden as US president. And a final point on the CJK triangle. Well, I understand that the CJK triangle is in very bad shape, and surprisingly enough, this time it shouldn't be blamed on China. It is rather to be blamed on the Japan-Korea relation. And on this very specific point, I think that precisely negotiations like RCEP are the good forum to discuss. Because in this slightly broader forum, the tension, the bilateral tension, can be diluted. Mm-hmm. So I think that RCEP or CPTPP, but Korea is not yet part of CPTPP, South Korea is part of RCEP. So I think that a number of things can be agreed on, and some progress can be made within this limited forum where the tension, the bilateral tensions, can be diluted. So I would advise Korea to put perhaps more effort into this kind of negotiation, so that, and at the end of the day, it can be a way to rebuild some kind of trust in the bilateral relation. Okay,
Professor Montbrial?
Well, I think that in the tough coming years that we are facing, it is the general interest of the world, if I can say so, first, that the European Union succeeds. We need a strong European Union in the interest of all of us. And second, we, the Europeans, need to strengthen further our relations, both political and economic, with you. I mean with Korea, but more generally with the middle powers of Asia. And that is becoming a major strategic, economic, political issue. So let us work more together.
Okay, we now would like to conclude the whole session. As a moderator, I really enjoyed speaking to you. We are having this discussion like we are in the same room. I mean, very, very nicely done, even though this, very difficult kind of pandemic situation. I think this World Knowledge Forum is pioneering in connecting the people all over the world and have a very effective and efficient discussion. We can concentrate on more rather than sitting in the big room and talking to each other. It's very nicely done. So I want to praise the staff and other people who prepared this session, and we hope we can do similar things again with a different topic. I thank you all, and especially thank to these two people in Paris. We'll see you soon in one way or another. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.